Wow. Hey. My name is Dr. Lucas Bernier. I teach in the music department here at the University of Mary, and we are thrilled to have our guest artist today, or our guest presenter. We haven't had a music convocation presenter in quite a while, I think, since before COVID, so we're happy to be back on the program. Our presenter today has received degrees from the University of Alaska Anchorage and the University of Iowa. Lives in Palmer, Alaska, and is the owner and proprietor of the Percussion in the Valley Percussion Studio, private teaching studio. She is an amazing performer, educator, researcher. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce and give a warm welcome to Dr. Meggie Aube-Trammell.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad you all came today to listen to my presentation. So today we're going to be talking about women in music history and the challenges from the nuns of the Middle Ages to modern times. From the beginning of early music composition to the current era, women's role in music has evolved and developed. The focus of this presentation today will be on important women figures who have contributed greatly to the music that we still enjoy today. The societal role of women in music has certainly changed over the centuries. The role of women from the first century to modern times has seen drastic changes in what women are able to do in the music field. Upon the creation of music conservatories across Western Europe and the United States, women were first not admitted and then only admitted as performers and could not enter the composition field. Over time, these barriers have been erased, and women can now be found in all areas of music study. Percussion, which is my instrument of focus, has been one of the slower areas of instrumental music to see strong representation of women performers and educators. The evolution of women in percussion field during the 20th and 21st centuries will also be discussed during this presentation. So we're going to start with a very large span of time. This is the 1st through the 15th centuries, and just kind of keep in mind that we're like barely scratching the surface. There's a lot of things that could be discussed that we're not going to even get to today in this short presentation. So it's hard to get the overall picture of what women were doing during this time period, partly because of lack of documentation. So we can see that women were involved during this time period, but we may not have musical record of what they were doing or published work. So some of the things that are coming from this earlier time period are kind of pieced together based on the small information that we do have. So during this time period, we see women participating in secular and sacred music. So secular music would be anything outside of the church. That could be music for court or even just music that was played in public. And sacred music would be things that are written for religious services. Women tend to be more active in the secular music that we can see. That was less likely to be written down than sacred music. Sacred music was certainly more published than secular music. So again, we don't get to see the overall picture of what they were actually doing because we don't have a lot of notation from what they were doing. However, we see a lot of imagery. So you can find lots of images of women playing and participating in music during the time period. Some of the evidence that we see suggests that women were involved in the same secular activities as men were, so they were equally represented. Their involvement may have been more dependent on class rather than gender. So we see that women who are from a higher financial status would be more involved in music than women from a lower status. In the French literary sources from the time period, we can see that aristocratic women were singers of dance songs, chansons, and motets, which were all popular during that time period. And this will, of course, differ from country to country. And keep in mind, we're talking about Western music, so across the world, this would also be different. But for instance, in 14th century Italy, women's musical activity had to be in private. So from every country, it'll differ. And so there are many roles that women took during this time period as amateur and professional singers, instrumentalists, composers, benefactors, educators, and copyists. Some of the stories we see are very anecdotal, where women would, of course, be singing lullabies, sung by wet nurses, or songs that were sung by women weavers. Women also sang in church choirs and at Christian funeral rites, and there was a lot of social dancing, and we see a lot of imagery of that too. A genre that was popular during this time period was called the medieval lyric, and that was a song of personal poetic expression, and that was a major source of musical output during the time period, and it was very popular. This was part of a performing and oral tradition, not a written tradition, so a lot of these were not even written down. And women were more active in tradition than this tradition that was often reported. And I have a quote from music historian Michelle Edwards, and she says, "For each language and culture, we are much at the mercy of the selectors," meaning during that time period even, the things that the women were doing were not always written down. So these were sung by the troubadourists and the troubadours, And those were the terms of the composers and performers of this lyric poetry that was popular from 1100 to 1350. So we do have a female term. So we know for sure that women were involved with this. In Old French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Middle English, we have terms for women minstrels, which are very similar to the troubadours. Those are traveling performers who would travel across playing music, but also doing lots of things, such as tumbling and juggling, resuscitation, dancing, magic tricks, acrobatics, dog tricks. The minstrels kind of did everything, and there were women involved with that as well. The minstrels' position was very low. Some of them were slaves, and then others were either employed or hired by courts, but all of them were at a very low social status, and that's true for women and men, minstrels. As far as instruments they were allowed to play, wind and percussion instruments were certainly not deemed appropriate during that time period. Percussion and any sort of drum was thought to be very physical and very masculine in nature, so women were not allowed to play that. And wind instruments were thought to contort the face, and so that was also deemed to not be very feminine. Instruments they were allowed to play would be string instruments and the organ. However, the organ was not widely used in church services until the 14th century, so that took quite a while. Prior to that, there were no instruments in church services, just singing, and it was because they thought the instruments were pagan in nature. The only exclusion of that was in monasteries and convents, where they tend to be a little bit more progressive, and they did use the organ. We're going to talk about a female composer during this time period, Hildegard von Bingen. She lived from 1098 to 1179, and she's probably one of the most famous composers, period, during this time period. She was a 12th century theologian. She composed 77 religious songs and a lengthy musical drama that's kind of similar to an opera, and we didn't see anything like that during that time period, so she was really doing some new things. She founded her own convent in 1148. She was described as a mystic. She wrote about her visions, medical issues, and science. Her chants were widely advanced for the time period, and she had a wide range of pitches in her chants. So typically, a chant would have been about 1 octave in as far as the pitches that were being used, but she was using 2 to 3 octaves. So if we talk about that, just like using a marimba, like this would be 1 octave, but she was using sometimes 2 to 3 octaves of pitches, so that is a really large range. She also used things called melismas, and those are found in chants a lot. And a melisma is, and you'll have to excuse some of my singing here, but it's where you take a syllable and you do many pitches on one syllable. So if I'm singing Alleluia in a chant, the ah might be lay, and then you get to the lay. So with these melismas, she would do 30 to 50 pitches on one syllable, which was really uncommon. So she was doing some really different new things. She was also using really large intervals. Oh, I guess I have this one on. I can come over here anyways. She was using lots of large intervals. So typically in chant music, you see intervals of a second or a third or a fourth. She would use intervals of a fifth and even sometimes a sixth. So she was using wider leaps between the pitches in her music. So many of her chants focused on women. She wrote 77 chants that honored women. 16 of those were addressed to the Virgin Mary, 13 to St. Ursula and her women followers, and 4 were just to various groups of women. Women take an active role in the music's imagery. So a quote from Michelle Edwards, again, music historian, was that working within a women's community, Hildegard developed a remarkable leadership and extraordinary creativity. Only as a member of a religious community of women could she have brought together her scientific, artistic, and theological creations. So being part of a convent and being a nun really helped her develop her music that she was writing. So we're going to listen to a small example of her music, just so you can kind of hear what it sounded like. In this, you'll hear a drone. That's just a single pitch. And then over the top of that, you'll hear the voice. This was a very early form of music harmony.
Hi everyone, Mark Barden here.
For the sake of time, we're not going to listen to too much, but when I teach music appreciation and I teach my students about her, a lot of students tell me they like to listen to her music for studying. So if you are unfamiliar, maybe you can use that for your studying for your final exams. Unfortunately, education declined for women towards the end of this era because intellectual centers switched from monasteries and convents to urban universities, and in those, women were not allowed to be admitted for quite a while. So women had a lot more music educational opportunities early on than they did as we get into the later centuries. So we're going to move to the time period from 1450 to 1600. Again, we're barely scratching the surface. There's a lot of information that could be covered here. During this time period, though, women's role tended to be that of marriage, motherhood, and managing the house. Entering a convent was still done, and that was primarily for wealthy women. Early writings were found about girl musicians, but then you see all these writings about them as young girls, but then by the age of 20, they kind of just disappear and go off record. So we know that girls were participating in music at a younger age, but maybe not professionally and as they aged. Wealthy women were expected, though, to read music, sing, dance, and play an instrument, but it was meant to be in private. So it was a skill that they wanted you to have, but not to do it in public. Noble women had the role of financially sponsoring and encouraging performers and composers, which indeed affected the music that was being written and performed. So if you have money and you can affect what was being done, women were having some effect on that too. In Italy, women making music was very important. There was a huge amount of women that were admitted into convents. In 1563, over 1/3 of Italian teenage females were admitted into convents. By 1650, 3/4 of female children in the Milanese aristocracy went to convents. So it was a really common and popular thing to do. Physical and intellectual freedom were found in convents, and they were allowed to be trained in other fields, music being one of those. However, until the 17th century, we have no written record of what they were doing, even from the convents of these women in Italy. So there's not a lot of record of what was even being made as far as what they were composing. A major source of music education that was closed off to girls was something called the capella. And this was a group of musicians that were employed by the church or a court to create and perform music. And this was for sacred or secular events. Young boys would be educated in the capellas in singing, performing instruments, and composing. This was a major training for musicians in the church through the 18th century. Young girls, though, were not allowed to be apprentices or be educated through this, so they missed out on that educational opportunity. A big span of time that we have no record, again, and I keep saying this, but we don't have any musical compositions from women from 1300 to 1566. However, music scholars believe that that doesn't mean that they were not writing music. There were many anonymous pieces being composed and published. So the quote that I have from scholar Karen Pendle is that many anonymous works in both manuscript and printed sources of the time, particularly those whose texts speak with a woman's voice, increase the likelihood that music by women from about the years 1300 to 1566 had indeed been preserved, and that the circumstances of its composition and preservation have prevented us from identifying it. So there is a belief that women were composing music and publishing music even, but in anonymous fashion. In the 17th and 18th century, we see a rise in involvement of women in music on a public basis. Some instruments became acceptable for women to play, and some of the examples I put up here is art from the time period of women playing music. And you can see in the pictures a woman playing a harp, a woman playing an early version of the piano, and a woman playing a lute. So women were allowed to play even in public and also have their portraits done. We see big families of musicians, where music is a tradition from the parents passing it down to their children. The parents are musicians, and they tend to train all of their children in music, and that includes all of their female children as well. When musical women married into musical families, they're often kept performing and playing music. So we see that continuing on, where they didn't have to stop playing. In this century, in this time period, we see a really important element coming in music, and that is opera. It's a very popular new genre that was created and developed during the time period. And the opera singer is a performing role that women could do. The soprano or mezzo-soprano were the favored voice for most solo or vocal music. And then opera singers and composers could be women. Court music required female singers, so that also was another position for them. In the 17th century, published music from nuns and masses and other liturgical music can also be found, so we have record of sacred music as well. And then, unfortunately, during the 18th century, we see a decline in the convents, where we don't have as many people involved in entering them. And part of that is also due to the Napoleonic Wars that are happening. There's a lot of strife happening during this time period that kind of takes away from that. Women are more active as instrumentalists during this time period. Until the mid-18th century, harpsichord and organ were the main keyboard instruments for composing and performing. Women harpsichord performers and composers could perform, but the organ was not as common except in convents. And the popularity of the piano also came about with the popularity of women playing music on the piano. It went hand in hand as performers and composers. One of the composers we're going to talk about is Barbara Strozzi. She lived from 1617 to 1664. She was a Venetian composer and singer, and she was renowned as the most virtuosic singer of the time period. She studied music with opera composer Francesco Cavalli, and she made her career by publishing her compositions, which include 8 volumes of published music in Venice between 1644 to 1664. Over 100 works, all vocal music, and then also solo voice with continuo, which we're going to hear a little example of. The continuo was probably played by the lute, which were also thought to be performed by her, so we believe that she played her original music. She didn't perform publicly as often, but her music circulated very widely all over Europe, even outside of Italy. She was very popular in Germany and in England. And most of her works are secular in nature, except for a few exceptions. And she was probably the most prolific composer of secular music in the century, men included. She was very, very prolific. We're going to listen to a small example of her music as well. And this one is called Lagrimi Mi, which is... You're already hearing it. It's the translation is My Tears, and this is a secular poem about love and loss. It specifies in the score that's meant for soprano voice, and this is in the style of a Baroque opera recitative. And it's really similar in style to Monteverdi, who is a name that more people might know if they've studied music history. Monteverdi was a very famous Baroque opera composer, and I feel like when I listen to this, I feel a lot of the same kind of feel that he was also doing during that time period. And in this, you'll hear the harpsichord accompaniment playing the basso continuo with the female voice. You already got a little taste of it, but we'll back it up. So very much in the style of that very tragic Baroque opera that was happening during the time period. So Venetian conservatories were established during the 17th and 18th century, and it's different than the conservatory that we think of today when we talk about music conservatories. There were 4 of these in Venice, and these cared for people in need, specifically orphan boys and girls. Girls who showed music talent were given music education and performance opportunities at these conservatories. There were full choirs and orchestras made up of only girl performers, which would have been very rare during that time period. Antonio Vivaldi, who's a probably more famous name for most people, he was a Baroque composer from Italy, and he was a teacher at one of these conservatories. He wrote at least 22 violin concertos that were specifically written for girls at the conservatory. At the conservatories, the length of study was about 10 years. After completion, the girls could become teachers, and so that definitely gave them a chance for a career in music outside of the convent. They could also stay on as performers in the orchestra or as choirs after they had graduated. If a student left the conservatory to get married, she had to agree that she would not publicly play music anymore. So her only chance of playing music was in the conservatory. She couldn't do it outside the conservatory, and that even went as a nun. So they were very specific that your music making must happen in this conservatory and not outside of it. The other composer we're going to talk about from this time period is Elizabeth Claude Jacquet de la Guerre. She lived from 1665 to 1729. A review of one of her performances from the Mercure Galant says, "For 4 years, a wonder has appeared here. She sings at sight the most difficult music. She accompanies herself and accompanies others who wish to sing at the harpsichord, which she plays in a manner that cannot be imitated. She composes pieces and plays them in all the keys asked of her, and she is still only 10 years old. So that was an early review of her. And when I read that, it really reminds me of Mozart, actually, as a child prodigy that was able to do all of these amazing things. But she is not a name that we hear very often, which is why I want to talk about her and kind of expose you to her too. But she definitely had that same upbringing of being a child prodigy. She was the daughter of a French organist. Both her parents were musicians and came from families of musicians. She first studied the harpsichord with her father, and then she was offered a stay at Versailles, where she received formal education in music from the king's mistress. I found interesting. At age 18, she married an organist and harpsichord teacher, and then moved back to Paris and kept composing. So even after marriage, she kept doing her music. She wrote ballet, she wrote opera, harpsichord music, violin solos, trio sonatas. She wrote 3 volumes of cantatas. She was very prolific. She wrote a lot of music. And she was actually also very active as a public performer. Upon her death, a review from Edward Titon du Toulet says, she had a very great genius for composition and excelled in vocal music the same as instrumental. One can say that never had a person of her sex had such talents as she for the composition of music and for the admirable manner in which she performed at the harpsichord and on the organ. So she was thought to be a very talented female composer, and it's kind of interesting that they throw that in there. She's probably one of the most well-known female composers from this time period, but I feel like she is not widely known. So it's good to learn about her a little bit. Much of her music is available in modern editions, so people do still play her music. And then the example I was going to use of her is a sonata for violin and harpsichord continuo. Oh, oopsie. All right, that gives you a little feel. To me, when I hear that, it reminds me of Vivaldi. So if you are familiar with Vivaldi, it kind of has a similar feel to it. So from 1800 to 1890, we see the patronage of arts moving to the middle class. So that is changing. The growth of the middle class is really expanding. This also equals a growth of public concerts, music festivals, concert halls, anything that can help the activity of the public. There's more music schools throughout Europe that we can find. Transportation becomes easier, so musicians are able to travel with more ease, and that's due to railroads and steamships. Women, we see more amateur musicians and professional, but in amateur musicians, we see more demand for published music, so that's creating the need for more published music. We see more demand for pianos and for music journalism. Aspiring middle-class families thought that music lessons for their daughters would help them climb a social ladder, so it was seen as a social status to be involved in music. And this would be primarily in voice and piano. Those were the 2 popular things. And they also thought it would help them improve their marriage possibilities if they were trained in music. Piano was a very popular performance instrument for women. It had a very strong association with domestic music making. We see at this point where piano is like one of the instruments you would have in your house. And we see that today, obviously, but it starts happening in the 1800s. It was okay for women to become amateurs, but upper and middle class women were discouraged from taking music too seriously or attempting it professionally. Women were only accepted in the supportive role to the men who were composing and performing music. Women functioned as the muse, and they inspired and nurtured the male's artistic endeavors. In 1795, Wilhelm von Humboldt, a German linguist, educator, and scholar, said, quote, "Creative force is more attuned to aggressive movement, while receiving force is more attuned to regressive movement. That which animates the former we call male, that which inspires the latter female. All that is male shows more spontaneous activity, all that is female, more passive receptivity." And this was an acceptable viewpoint for men and women during the time period. And we're going to talk about Clara Schumann in just a few minutes here. And many scholars believe that she was from this time period and believe that that is why she struggled with some of the composing and performing activities that she did, is because of that viewpoint. Music historian Nancy Reich said, quote, "The prevailing views on proper feminine behavior, passive and submissive, were so firmly entrenched that she was uncomfortable about her role as a composer. Nevertheless, she had no qualms about appearing as a performer, which he considered to be a recreative activity. So composition for a very long time was thought to be a male activity because you were creating the music, where performing was more acceptable because you were just recreating what had already been done. Newly created music conservatories gave more training for musicians, but not for women at the beginning. By the 1870s, however, conservatory classes began to admit women in orchestration and composition. Women training to be performers or teachers would be trained to be performers and teachers and not conductors or composers. And the limited study they had would be voice, piano, and harp at first. And then as we see it, it expands as we go through time. They were not encouraged to study orchestral instruments in the conservatories until late into the 19th century. So Clara Schumann was a composer during this time period. She lived from 1819 to 1896. She was born in Leipzig. Her mother was a pianist and singer, and her father was a music pedagogue and music merchant. She entered the music world as a child prodigy. Her father made sure she had music education, and she studied piano with him and theory, harmony and counterpoint, and composition with teachers in Leipzig, Dresden, and Berlin. She met Robert Schumann, who was a very popular composer during the time period, and she ends up filing a lawsuit against her father so she could marry him in 1840. He did not want them to get married. There's a whole scandal there. After marriage, she continued to compose, teach, and perform, even with the births of 8 children. After Robert's death in 1856, she stopped composing but resumed her performance career. Her career as a concert pianist lasted over 60 years, and that's longer than any other musician during this century, so she performed for a very long time. One of the first piano performers to perform by memory, and she was also one of the first to play complete recitals without any other artists. She had a huge influence on later generations of piano performers. So I'm going to be playing a piece of hers today. It is her Prelude in B flat, and I'm going to move over here. And my experience with Clara Schumann before this presentation actually is I teach music appreciation, and she's one of the composers that I talk about during the Romantic period. And usually we talk about Robert Schumann, and then Clara Schumann is kind of the footnote to Robert Schumann, but I always make sure that I include her and we listen to some of her music. But when we talk about her music, I feel like they paint an image of her music being very delicate in nature and really mild and meek and like kind of easy to listen to. When I decided to learn this piece, I was really surprised at all of the interesting tonalities she uses and harmonies, which you're going to hear. You'll be playing along, and all of a sudden there's like an E flat in there that you were not expecting. You're like, why is there a C sharp right with an E flat? Like, what kind of harmony is that? Like, what is she trying to do? So I feel like the thing that we don't learn about her, and that I don't feel like I really learned about her until learning a piece of her music, was just some of the very innovative harmonic elements she was putting into her music during this time period. I feel like she was very groundbreaking in the music she wrote, and I don't think we get that image of her. So I'm glad I learned this piece because I feel like I learned more about her by learning her music. I think that's a way that we can really get to know composers a little bit better. If we're studying them, it's kind of nice to be able to see exactly what they were doing. So obviously she did not write this for the marimba. The marimba was not in anyone's viewpoint at that point in Western Europe at the time period. She wrote it for piano, and then I made an arrangement of it for the marimba, and I had to tweak a couple things, but I think I got most of it in there. So. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was the first time I got to perform that, so I'm glad I got to do that today. Okay. So 2 threads that we can see for success from all the time periods we've talked about and then going forward were the importance for role models and the importance of networking and connecting with peers. And this will remain as elements that we need for success today. So scholar Marcia Citrone said, quote, "Men had the benefit of a long history of role models and support systems. Women, on the other hand, due in part to their ignorance of their own past, still had few female composers as role models and lacked the support of colleagues or family." So like we've been talking about through time, the music wasn't written down, so many women didn't even know what women had done before them. So it's kind of hard to have a role model if you didn't even know what had come before. It was very rare for women to venture into the orchestral realm. Symphonies and pieces for large groups were considered to be masculine forms for performances in large concert halls. Writing pieces for orchestra required skills that women didn't have the opportunity to learn. Women also didn't have access to groups that could rehearse and perform their music, and they didn't have the ability to network like their male counterparts. Scholar Nancy Reich says all composers, male and female, needed, indeed still need, connections to the men who held the power in the musical world. This posed a special difficulty for women as they were less likely to know the right people. This is going to directly tie into women composers today and percussionists of today. So we're going to discuss 2 living composers. These are both women composers that are still alive. Joan Tower is the first, and she was born in 1938 in New Rochelle, New York. A large portion of her childhood was in South America, so that ends up influencing a lot of her compositions. If you've never heard her music, it has a lot of Latin feel to it, but also has a lot of percussion instruments. It's very rhythmic in nature, and she's written some really great things. She returned to the United States and received her doctoral degree in composition from Columbia College. And in 1972, she became composition professor at Bard College. She was the first woman to receive a Grammy Award for composition, and she has been commissioned by top-tier orchestras such as the New York Philharmonic, the Chicago Symphony, and the St. Louis Symphony to write music for them. She wrote a really interesting piece that we're going to listen to a small portion called Fanfare for the Uncommon Woman. And this is 6 different pieces composed between 1987 to 2014. You laugh because you all know this is a play on the title of Aaron Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man. And she writes, "I'm a great admirer of Copland, and he influenced me in many ways. So it was a tribute to him, but at the same time, the title of his fanfare bothered me, so I turned it around. It's dedicated to women who are adventurous, take risks, and are visionaries in some sense." So we're just going to listen to a little bit of her fanfare.
Lost North Dakota Medicaid? Healthcare.
Sorry, I had one queued up, so I was ready. And they're not very long, so I hope you take some time and listen to the fanfares. They're all pretty interesting. The other composer I want to share with you is Libby Larsen, and some of you might be familiar with her. She's written a lot of music. She was born in 1950 in Wilmington, Delaware. She's one of the most important successful American composers today. She has composed over 500 works, and those include everything from orchestra works, ballet, over 15 operas. She's written music for chorus, theater, chamber ensembles, solo pieces. She's just done a lot. She's also a Grammy Award winner. In graduate school in the 1970s, she was told by a male classmate that she could never write contemporary music for a large audience because she was a woman, and she certainly showed him wrong. In 1973, she co-founded the American Composers Forum, and she's held residencies with the Minnesota Orchestra, the Charlotte Symphony, and the Colorado Symphony. So she's done a lot of big orchestral works as well. being a woman composer, she always said that she was considered a little bit abnormal during her time kind of studying music and composing early on. And she said, quote, "I found that being a living woman composer in the academy often, and still does, put me in the position of the specimen." So she kind of always had to deal with being in that position of being a little bit unique. I was going to play an example of hers, but I want to make sure that I have enough time to get my kind of my last big point in. So look her up. If you don't know her music, she's written some really good stuff. She actually reminds me of Erin Copeland. She does a lot of like really long drifting melodies with her orchestral work. I think you might, if you know Erin Copeland, you might recognize a little bit of that in her music. So we're going to talk about a topic that's really near and dear to me as a percussionist. I did my doctoral dissertation on women percussion. This was back in 2011, and that was my research of choice, and I continue to do research on the topic. My background, I started the piano in the 3rd grade, and then I really wanted to play percussion in the 5th grade when band started, and I was able to choose another instrument. And I really wanted to play the drums. I wanted to be a drum set player so bad. I even had to like convince my parents. I made this little bucket, pot and pan drum set, and I was like, I don't know, I wasn't even a little kid. I was like 11 years old, and I was just really wanted a drum set so bad. And they bought me one. I pushed them. But in school, I was always pushed towards melodic instruments, like the marimba. That was always kind of the thing that the teachers wanted me to play. And that always made me wonder. And then I actually quit playing percussion in 7th grade, partly because of that, because I wasn't allowed to play the drums. And it really wasn't even the band director that wasn't allowing me, just he wasn't supporting. And there was lots of boys, and I was the only girl, and I was very timid, and I couldn't get on the drums. I couldn't weasel my way in there. So I quit, because I just wasn't doing what I wanted to do. And then in 8th grade, a new band director comes in, and they were a lot more supportive, and they helped me kind of speak up for myself a little bit more. So I got back into percussion. And I often wonder, what would my life look like if I would have just quit and just not played at all? And I wonder how many other girls have gone through that experience that might also be playing if they didn't have similar experiences like that. And so it always made me wonder, why are we pushed towards the melodic instruments, which I love. I love playing these instruments, but why is that kind of the focus? Why are some instruments seem to be deemed more appropriate for girls than boys? And so it made me think there was a need for research here. So the purpose of my research was to show the emergence of women percussionists from 1930s to present, and then also just to describe the state of women in percussion today. So the goals of my document were to find out why there are fewer female percussionists than male, and then help younger females find their roots in percussion, because we oftentimes, just like we've heard all the way throughout history here, we hear a lot about male performers, but we don't hear about the female performers as much. And then women are not always aware of their background and where they're coming from. So my goal was to give younger female performers some role models and give them ideas of women who had done things before them. So I did a lot of research on just the state of women in percussion, and I looked at, well, where are we professionally? In 2 areas, I looked at a lot of areas. I'm not going to go into all of this today. There's certainly not time. But I looked at 2 specific areas that I'm going to talk about today: orchestral percussionists and college percussion professors. And I did a study in 2010 where I looked at all of the university, or all of the, I'm talking about orchestral music. I looked at all of the orchestras that were in the top 2 tiers, and that's orchestras who have a $7 million budget or over. And of those orchestras, there are 163 timpani and percussion spots, and of those spots, only 5% were held by women in 2010. I did that study just this spring again to be in preparation for this presentation, and in 2024, of all the spots of timpani and percussion in those top 2-tier orchestras, 4.9% are women, so really about the same. And there's older studies that were done by the Percussive Art Society in 1975, and of all the percussion spots in those orchestras, 5.5% were women. So from 1975 to 2024, the numbers pretty much just stayed the same. 5% of the women in the top orchestras are, there's only 5%. And then I did a study on college percussion professors, and I surveyed the College Music Society directory, and I did one of these in 2010. And of the 1,691 percussion professors at these universities, 105 were female, which is 6%. I did the study again this spring, and of all the college professors, 121 were women, which is equal to 6.8%. A little bit of increase. And then in the past, the College Music Society has also done studies on this, and the earliest one was from 1972, where they found 6% of the percussion professors were women. So I'm just going to say it's 6%. That's kind of holding strong from 1972 to 2024. So not a lot of change. The one area that I'm pretty proud of, because I'm a member of the Percussive Art Society, it is our organization for percussionists, we have seen a lot of change in leadership, actually, which has been very, I think is hopefully going to help kind of in the future. When you look at the leadership, and this includes the board of directors, the board of advisors, the committee chairs, in 2024, of all those positions, 31% were female. In 2010, when I did a similar study, 13% were female. So that, to me, is a pretty significant increase and change. And in the picture, well, a couple pictures that are up there, the woman with the chime, she's one of the longest running female percussionists in a symphony orchestra. Her name's Patty Dash, and she plays with the Chicago Symphony, and she's just one of the longest women that have held a spot in a major orchestra. And then the two women on the other side is our first female president of the Percussive Art Society, Lisa Rogers, and then the other one is also Lisa, and she is our current Percussive Art Society president. So I do feel like the Percussive Art Society is making a big effort to be more inclusive, and hopefully that'll help give role models to the younger girls coming up in percussion. So I do feel like there are reasons for why we are where we are today. And why percussion is kind of still designated as a male instrument. Part of this is childhood socialization, and that's the categorization of female suitable professions and the characteristics that are deemed appropriate for women are experienced in early childhood. Boys avoid feminine things, while girls increase in femininity as they age. The parents are often in charge of socialization of their children and what's appropriate, and parents tend to also steer their children in different directions. Social groups are also formed based on sex. Girls like to do girl things, boys like to do boy things. We see that across the board, and percussion has always tended to be more of a boy thing, and it still tends to be. Instrument gender bias is another one. Some instruments are considered masculine, while some are considered feminine. In the percussion world, mallet instruments are considered more appropriate for females to play than drums. And we've seen that kind of throughout time in percussion. Teachers have a huge role on this. Band directors, when they're helping students decide instruments, they're going to affect that a whole bunch. So based on what their perceptions are of what instrument's appropriate. There are lots of studies on instrumental gender bias. They began in the 1970s and they're still going. In most of these, they'll survey students to determine what instruments were thought to be appropriate. Girls, still from the 70s to present, choose the flute, the violin, and the clarinet. And boys, from the 70s to the present, still choose drums, trumpet, and trombone. So there's a pretty clear delineation of what instruments were thought to be appropriate for each gender, and this is by the students themselves, just kind of what they believe. Role models is a really important function that we are missing. A quote from Sarah Maidlow, who's a scholar, says, "Each sex appears to have a strong tendency to look to people of their own sex, as well as their own instrument, from whom to gain support, encouragement, and models of ambition." So if you're not seeing women in the professional highest level fields, there's probably a reason why we don't have as many female percussionists. Flute remains feminine because most professionals are female, and drums masculine for the same reason. And percussion will continue to have a strong association as a masculine instrument, while the majority of the most distinguished performers and educators are male. And then just struggles for women in career, and this goes across the board. Part of those are trying to make a domestic life work with a professional life, maybe having to take on a little bit of a masculine role in order to succeed where there's more males involved, and then just the networking element where there are more males in the field, it's different to network as a female. So. By serving the lives of women composers and performers in Western music history through the present, we can weave together a story of the evolution of women's involvement in music. From centuries of time where music composed by women was not recorded or done so anonymously, to women of today who are able to make a name for themselves and find great success, we see similar threads and issues that many women have had to deal with. Fighting stigmas of which instrument were deemed appropriate for women to play is still an issue today, as male-associated instruments are still predominantly performed and taught by men at the highest professional levels. The need for role models, seen as lacking in earlier eras due to no written record of women compositions, is still a continuing issue today due to a minority of women in the highest professional levels. Networking within a circle of composers or instrumentalists dominated by a specific gender was an issue throughout time and persists today. While there are issues prevalent over time, we do see forward momentum, of course. Women today are allowed to pursue all forms of music education and choose any musical instrument. The struggle will be to keep shifting our ideas on what is appropriate for either gender to play. We will need to keep illuminating women in the field of music for the next generation to have role models to strive towards. And that is one of my goals. I want to thank you all so much for coming today. This was really fun for me to prepare this presentation. I want to thank University of Mary for allowing this to happen and for doing these convocations. And I want to thank Dr. Lucas Bernier for making it work and getting it all set up for me. I have a couple minutes, so if there's any questions, I wouldn't mind answering or anything that you just maybe thought of while I was speaking. Otherwise, I thank you so much for all coming today. But if there's anything that you would want to ask or talk about, I'm here. Or even if you want to come up at the end. Cool. Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, yes.
So, thank you for this. Great, thanks. Many parts of this were fascinating, but I confess the thing that stuck in my head, I was blown away. I'm not even sure I heard it correctly. What was the statistic on the percentage of Italian girls during the Renaissance joining convents?
Oh, yeah, it's crazy. I know. That was, let me get my numbers here. It was intense. In 1563, over 1/3 of Italian teenage females were admitted into convents. Wow. And then by 1650, and this is in Milan, but that's, a very big city, 3/4 of the female children went into convents. Yeah, I know. That was when I researched that. It was also mind staggered. But I think part of it was because it gave them education that they couldn't get outside of it. I mean, I'm sure there was religious reasons too, but I think that was kind of the way to get education.
Are they there permanently, or is the idea that they're just going for grade school, effectively?
No, becoming nuns.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. That was also very, and I probably went through a lot of these things really quick, but thank you for pointing that out. That was also very interesting to me too.
So I was staggered by the numbers since 1970. They're just the same. That's astonishing. Is that true of the rest of the orchestra? Like if we look at trombones, is it like the number of women in trombones is also this? Do you know?
So there are other people, because I found research on other people that have done similar studies to me, but in other areas of the orchestra. And so in the orchestra, the flute and the harp are pretty, those are the most where females dominate, and violin. And then when you get into even clarinet, though, that's a little bit of a different one. But yeah, the low brass, that is same, yeah. Yeah. I know, it's kind of a little bit like you think, things maybe have changed, but not a lot.
Have you noticed, at the professional level, these are the numbers, but I'm a trombonist, and I've noticed, even in our community here, there's actually, I keep seeing more and more young women in, low brass, at, sort of the amateur school level. Are you noticing those kind of trends in percussion as well? They maybe just don't get all the way to the top tier.
So that is what I actually want to do more of my research on, and I feel like anecdotally, I know as a female percussion teacher, I get a lot more girls. I just know that, and I would like to study, and this I think would take a lot of work. I don't even know how I'd do this really, but to study other people who run percussion studios like I do, and see, okay, do women and men have different, and what is that? And then also, like you said, are there more females in percussion in high school, and then they're just not going on to college, or they're not going on professionally? I mean, that, and I don't even know how, that's a lot to, I would love for someone to tell me how to even get started doing that, how to research that and how to find out those kind of numbers. Because I do agree, I think at a younger level, you might see more diversity. Yeah.
Do you have any experience, have you seen percussion being used in worship services or masses or things like that outside of just the regular drum set?
Yeah, I personally have. So one of my jobs when I first moved back to Alaska was I was a music director at a church, and we used a lot of percussion, like the djembe and lots of things, so not just the drum set. So I personally have experience doing that, and I feel like more and more you see more percussion being involved, not just the drum set in liturgical settings. And I try to do interesting things, with the choir, I would have the choir play percussion while we did certain pieces. So I mean, that's just me as a percussionist. So I can't say across the board, but I feel like that is, definitely some room there. Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you again so much. I really appreciate you all being such an awesome audience. Thank you. Thank you.